Well, if there was someone between what you were willing to pay and that price who bid there, then you're in trouble because you have to pay more than it's worth to you. So you always have an incentive to report exactly what it's worth to you. Yeah, Ben?
Is this conditional also on like information? Like if you can figure out what the other people want to pay for it, then you can see resisting.
No, that's not true.
If I know that you're like the maximum that you'd ever be willing to pay is 50.
Yep.
And then all I have to do.
But I still can't do any better than just reporting my true value. Because what I pay has nothing to do with what I bid, as long as I win. So if I know the maximum you're willing to pay is 50, I might as well bid my true value, maybe that's 200, because I still only have to pay 50. That's what's so brilliant about this system. It's actually quite related to the English auction. The English auction is when people just raise their hand and the price goes up. Because in reality, what you basically do is you have in the back of your mind, here's the maximum I'm going to bid. And if it gets up to a certain level, I drop out. And I end up just paying whatever the last person who dropped out was. So in some sense, this is just a way, in a sealed bid context, of running the English auction. Now, this is sometimes used in what are called multi-unit or package auctions. And in those contexts, you can't just use this simple second price things, because what you're bidding for are not like one good, but there's like 100 different things. So like what they did in the FCC is there were all these different parts of the country, and they carved up the country into different parts, and then carved up each part of the country into different parts of the spectrum. And then people could submit a bid for any collection of all this stuff, right? And the point is there's a zillion different things they could bid for. There's a zillion different ways it could be assigned across people. And so to figure out what people should pay in the second price basically required doing the whole VCG thing. It's like, if this person hadn't bid anything, then what would the allocation have been, and how much does it hurt people that that's the sort of analysis you need to do. This is actually also exactly what they do at the Booth School for doing course selection. So what happens at the Booth School is you submit your list of courses and like what you're willing to pay for each list of courses, and then you have this like artificial currency where whatever you bid, they figure out what your VCG payment is basically, and that's what you have to pay. And there are many proposals to use this in other contexts, but it's very uncommon in practice. One example, and this actually comes out of a paper that I worked on, is an alternative to using eminent domain. So instead of using eminent domain, where the government just comes in and if it wants to build a road through an area, it just takes people's land and pays them something. If you want to figure out whether it's actually efficient to take that away from them based on how much people value their homes, you could use the VCG mechanism where everyone says, here's how much I'm willing to pay to stay. The government says, here's how much I'm willing to pay to take the land, and you have used some mechanism like this. Okay, so why isn't VCG used more often? Well, there's a famous article which is often used to summarize VCG, which is to say that it's elegant. It has this amazing incentive property, but we don't actually see it being used. So it's called lovely but lonely. Is Temis here? No. Does anyone else have an idea why VCG isn't used very much in practice? Yeah, go ahead, Cody.
Like you said before, there has to be a third-party administrator.
Yeah, so there has to be someone else who can take the money out, and that causes a whole bunch of problems. So that's a problem in itself, but it's a source of a lot of other problems. So what do you do with the leftover money? It has to go to the government rather than to the individuals involved. And this might be fine if there's only a few people who are affected by this, because you can use the money on someone else in society. But if the externality affects large numbers of people, or maybe the whole society, what are you supposed to do with that money? You'd have to burn it, or ship it to a foreign country or something like that, right? And this can effectively ruin the efficiency. Because even if you get the right allocation, all that money that you lose is real money. And it's a shame to lose it, right? A second problem is collusion. So this is one of the worst problems because two people can basically blow up the whole system. So imagine that we used VCG to determine the outcome of an election. There were just two, candidate A could win or candidate B could win. And everyone was said to say how much they'd be willing to pay for candidate A to win versus B winning. So some people's numbers would be positive, other people's numbers would be negative. Now, in principle, that could be very efficient. But the problem is that imagine that there were just two people who wanted, Bush rather than Gore to win, right? And they each said they were willing to pay $1 trillion to see Bush win over Gore win, right? Then they would win, right, for sure, because they would outweigh everybody else. And they wouldn't have to pay anything. Why wouldn't they have to pay anything? Well, imagine that one of the people who said that they were willing to pay $1 trillion wasn't participating. So individually, if two people both say really extreme things, individually neither of them makes a difference. And therefore they don't end up having to pay anything. Right? And so what that means is in general in VCG, two people can just totally blow up the system. They can get whatever they want and pay nothing for it. Yeah, Bill?
In your example, I don't understand. Does everyone actually pay the amount?
No, if they change, so what does VCG say? It says if you change the outcome, right? If what you're having said makes something different happen than would have happened otherwise, then you have to pay the amount by which you hurt other people. So if there was one person and they said that they valued Bush winning at $1,000 and that was enough just to tip the scales, then they'd have to pay however much the total of everybody else was, because that's how much harm they caused to everybody else. But if two people each say $1 trillion, right, then removing either one of them makes no difference. And so they can just completely sabotage the whole system. Sung-ho?
Yeah, well, I had a question about the auction system.
Yeah.
So then, wouldn't yelling out enormous amount of money would always sort of win you the thing that you want to buy?
But maybe for way too much money.
Yeah, but then the thing is if everyone wants this radio for $50 for range of 50, $60, but then someone yells $60 and I yell $1 million.
Yeah.
But then the next person who ever yells out a bigger amount of money, he has a risk of actually winning, right? But then
Yeah.
he wouldn't really want to pay for the radio $1 million.
That's right, but the way that the English auction works is it goes in very small increments,
Right.
so that nobody can do a jump bid like what you're describing, and therefore discourage other people from participating. But there are problems of collusion, which is that, imagine that everybody knows that Anthony's willing to pay more than Sung-ho is to buy something. Then you Sung-ho, have no incentive really to bid anything. I mean, you could bid what you want, but you're never going to win anyway. So you might as well bid zero. Maybe Anthony comes up to you and says, Sung-ho, let me just give you $1 and just don't bid anything. Then I'll get it for free. I'm going to win anyways. So that's another example of this type of collusion that's very easy to do in this case. And it can get even worse. So it's not just that different people can collude with one another. It's that, imagine that there was one person and they could just pretend like they were two people somehow. Right? Then they can get whatever they want for zero. Right? So that's a pretty messed up system. If one person, just by being two, can get whatever they want and pay nothing, right? So in practice, VCG is a total disaster. Even though it's this beautiful idea, it doesn't actually make sense in any real-world context, basically. So why does VCG go so badly wrong? Well, the basic problem is exactly what was identified by Cody, which is that in this context, everyone has to say what other people's externalities are on them, right? That is, we're taking each person's word for what the externalities caused by someone else are. And what that means is that everyone is going to have an incentive to get in league with whoever it is that's determining what the externality they cause is, and collude with them, right? Basically, the problem we have is that while this system can be very useful for getting each individual to report what their value is, they're affecting other people. So if in any way they can talk to one another, or if my payments, rather than just going to some outside person, go to the other person, then that's going to totally mess up all the incentive properties. Because the externalities people are paying is determined completely by what someone else says, rather than by some objective information. So the very value of the system, which is that it bases the externalities on what people say, is exactly its problem, right? So what we need instead is some sort of an objective information at some point down the line, which says, okay, we're willing to take people's word on what the externality is in this sense, but we need to know something more objective about what the externality caused by them saying that is, so we're not just relying on other people for that. Because otherwise they're going to have an incentive to get into league with those other people and it'll mess up the system. That is, we need to make people prove that in fact other people are exerting an externality on them, not just claim that they are. Because otherwise it's going to be too easy for those people to get together and collude with each other. And these problems are actually very closely related to one another. So if one person is going to pay for saying that another person did something wrong, then we need to know what the other person might do. And so that is going to require us to bring in some more objective information. So in particular, it would be very useful if rather than just relying on people to tell us what all the externalities were, if we had some external objective information about what we expect the externalities of people to be. And in fact, there's a famous theorem which shows that any efficient system requires that every time someone changes the decision we make as a society, they have to pay the average externality that they cause. That's basically just an application of Pigue's principle that we learned last class. And VCG satisfies this because everybody pays the exact externality that they in fact end up causing. But that's not necessary. All that's necessary is that everyone pays the average externality they're likely to cause, averaged over what the values of everyone else is. And if we don't have to just rely on what everybody else says to determine this, but we have some objective basis, we can do a lot better than we can for these collusion reasons if we have to always rely on exactly what everyone says. So for example, if we have people just pay their expected externalities rather than the ones they actually end up causing, then we can pay the money back to everyone. Because no one's individual report affects what other people pay. And therefore what they receive back, and therefore they don't have an incentive to lie about it. There's no more issue with collusion, because us getting together can't affect what I have to pay. So the more we use this sort of expected externality, the less collusion we can do and the more money we can give back. And sometimes it can be pretty easy to compute the expected externality. So for example, the more common than a second price auction is a first price sealed bid auction, where you just say how much you're willing to pay. And basically you can show that in that case, people are going to bid how much, and it makes perfect sense, they expect the next person to bid. How much they just have to do to beat the next guy, right? And so that gets them to pay their expectation of the externality, rather than having them pay what the externality ends up being. And that makes it much harder to do the sort of collusive things that I was talking about Anthony and Sunho did. And there's other circumstances where examples like this exist. So just to wrap up, and in fact I'm right now working on an alternative way to do elections based on expected externalities rather than on the VCG thing. Because the VCG thing's all messed up, but if you can make people pay expected externalities, that can be